Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this session. We're going to discuss reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring as some of the main global economic trends that are reshaping the way supply chain works, the way globalization, international commerce works after the disruption of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. We'll do this with a very high-profile and diverse panel. But before that, first, just an indication. Grab your headset for simultaneous translation. It will be useful during the session. Secondly, for initial remarks, we're delighted to have today the Undersecretary of the Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation Minister of Italy, Maria, Maria Tripodi. Please join me on the stage. Welcome.
Buongiorno a tutti, gentili ospiti.
Good morning, everybody, dear guests. It is a pleasure for me to open this panel, which deals with very topical themes. The themes that became topical during the pandemic, which were then exacerbated by the war in the Ukraine. I would like to thank the speakers who will participate in this panel, and I would also like to thank PMI Impact, which has been supporting the Rome Med dialogue as the knowledge partner of this conference. And this year is, this event is organized on a yearly basis by the Farnesina, and in view of the huge economic growth that has been experienced in these years, the horizons of the context within which we operate have opened up, thereby including a huge number of states. The pandemic and the Ukrainian crisis have interrupted a process that seemed on the way towards the linear development, despite the global difficulties that were piling up, from inadequate infrastructures to production models that were no longer sustainable, through to the prevalence of just-in-time market rationales. In March 2021, the closing down of the Suez Canal after the ever-given accident and the subsequent loss of $9 billion per day showed the world during the pandemic all the frailties of the international exchange system, which was stuck between the healthcare crisis and the sudden interruption of one of the main global business arteries, which was fundamental in ensuring the role of the Mediterranean as a logistic crossroads among the three continents. A very important debate took place on the future of globalization, which questioned the very structure of global supply chains, which were deemed overly long and complex, and thus no longer resilient, flexible, and adequate. Thus, a necessity emerged to decrease the vulnerability of exchanges, also through regionalization policies involving the very exchanges. The diversification of supplies and targeted interventions, reshoring interventions within the framework of production. And Italy has a lot to offer in this regard in order to attract foreign investments, thanks to a PME fabric that is very dynamic, very good craftsmanship, and a university, a research system that is absolutely excellent. Moreover, the NRPP incentives make Italy a very good opportunity to invest in semiconductors, biotechnologies, and renewable energies. Now, within this framework, the Farnesina intends to promote in the first months of 2023 an event entitled reshore it, strategic sector, and the futuristically in order to present people in the industry the opportunities provided by the Italian ecosystem. Now, for countries such as Italy, which is one of the largest when it comes to supply chains, the creation of policies that are aimed to reduce analogous shocks will take on a strategic role and respond to the twofold goal of reinforcing Italy's role as an input suppliers and finished product suppliers, thereby guaranteeing the continuity of our supplies. Now, in looking for solutions to this challenge, the enlarged Mediterranean, with which Italy has very good political and economic relations, has once again proved fundamental in order to ensure uh, safety and prosperity. And the Farnesina has launched a project aimed at supporting struggling enterprises and finding 19 critical raw materials coming from areas affected by the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. And many of these raw materials were pinpointed, were found within the Mediterranean area, and the need to diversify markets has also generated a further push towards the intensification of our partnership with the countries of the enlarged Mediterranean, with the goal of reaching independence from Russian gas by 2024. At the same time, we have been pursuing the goals that we have set ourselves with regard to the energy diversification and a growing interconnection of infrastructures aimed to transporting clean energies between the northern and southern shores, thereby launching a shared project in this direction, which may be advantageous to both of us and our regional partners. It is therefore clear that in this case, any crisis that emerges brings about opportunities as well. The huge impact of the pandemic and the Russian aggression on the Ukraine have questioned the paradigms that we have been relying on up to now. Now, given these changes, it is our responsibility not to repeat the mistakes we've made in the past and do our best in order to overcome these challenges by investing on cooperation and international collaboration. Thank you for the attention, and I wish the proceedings every success. Thank you.
Let me introduce the other panelists, starting with the Defense State Minister and Foreign Affairs, Thanks for joining us this morning. Marco Filizzati, Deputy Director for Internationalization and Trade Policy at Confindustria, Tarek Tafik, who's Deputy Chairman of the Federation of Egyptian Industry and the Egypt Center for Economic Study, and also President of the American Chamber of Commerce in Egypt, Blanca Moreno-Dodson, Director of the Center for Mediterranean Integration, and Marco Annapel, who's the CEO of Philip Morris in Italy. Welcome, everyone. Please take your seats. Let's have a round of applause just to start with some energy in the session.
Yeah. Thank
you. Minister, I would like to start with you because we already mentioned the impact of disruption as the pandemic and then the war in Ukraine. And resilience is today top priority for companies and for economies. How is Japan helping its supply chain to be more resilient?
Thank you very much. So let's see whether interpreters are here. Okay, so I am honored to represent the government of Japan at this forum for the first time in 3 years. My name is Shunsuke Takei, State Minister of Foreign Affairs Ministry in Japan. I would like to extend my respect for the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other organizers. Now, of course, there is a big geographical distance between Japan and the Mediterranean Sea. However, for many Japanese people, this region is an object of admiration as a stage of history and various civilizations being nurtured. So this region also has a strong economic ties with Asia. So now, due to globalization and digitalization, events in a small part of the world could impact immediately on other regions, and this has become a daily norm. So these changes have brought tremendous benefits to people, of course, through easier transportation and closer economic activities. However, they have also brought about a number of problems, such as the COVID pandemic, and become a factor in exerting a very serious impact on the international community as a whole. So the negative impacts of the globalizations, and of course, this has been felt by many countries by Russian aggression against Ukraine. So many countries, especially in the Mediterranean countries, are still struggling to recover from the energy and food crisis. Now, the current international community is in a state of flux, and of course, now the supply chains more advanced and everything else. So UN Charter and other common international rules need to be re-acknowledged now. This is the right time to do so because they are important as the basis and guide for our actions. And of course, Japan is highly dependent on import, especially for not just raw materials, but intermediary items. So, and supply chain is getting more advanced and complex as well. So again, the risk for vulnerability and disruption to supply chain is even bigger. And of course, lack of semiconductors in the global supply chain, as well as the South Asian pandemic reemergence, meant that supply manufacturing industry as a whole has been impacted terribly. And also, in particular, the transportation machinery manufacturers were really negatively impacted, but this industry actually affects everybody else in the overall industry. So as a whole, we could see from these examples that supply chain disruption is no longer an imagined or possible contingency, but it's a reality to come. And therefore, we must seriously look into this. And in order to deal with this in Japan, we actually set up a law on emergency, and this has become established already, and this actually helps the industries, the private companies, to be supported in case of emergencies in order to supply stably the identified specifically strategically important items. So we would like to emphasize that it is important to identify what's most crucial as an item for survival, and also we have international cooperation in order to deal with these. And of course, we must not be unprepared. We have to be prepared against the economic coercion that some countries may apply or are likely to apply in order to apply particular pressure by holding on to strategic choke points. So in order for us to prevent those and also to have a free and open international order and to have a strong and resilient supply chain, Japan looks forward to actively being involved in dialogues for this end. Thank you very much again for this opportunity to speak.
Thank you for that and for opening our discussion. Director Fick, I would like immediately to understand, with the Egyptian point of view, how your industries are expecting the consequences to be of what we're seeing. There will be more or less integration from an industrial perspective. Do you see any opportunities also coming in for your companies?
Huge opportunities. I mean, but it requires political will from both the North and the South, you know. I think the crises that we have been living through are creating new realities that impact us in, I would say, in a positive way by having to revisit old policies of supply chain management. Nearshoring is becoming a reality, and I think there has to be a collective effort from the European Union to help companies or assist them to reshore. We have seen that done on individual basis, country by country. In a country like Egypt, you know, we've seen that with Italy, Germany, France, and to a lesser extent other countries. But I think a collective approach, or a strategic approach is becoming far more important than it was before in order to be able to accelerate that. As far as we are concerned in Egypt, Egypt has invested heavily in infrastructure over the last 6-7 years, close to $400-500 billion. And when I mean infrastructure, it's across the board. When it comes to ramping up the facilities, ports, bridges, roads, telecommunications, wastewater recycling, power generation. And I think we have even extra capacity to even secure us for the coming decade. Egypt has a very diversified economical base, and it has been identified as one of the few countries by the Harvard Economic Complexity Index to have the opportunity or the possibility of double-digit growth in the coming decade. And the diversity of this economy stems from the fact that almost any and all industries do exist with varying degrees of skill. So scaling up, in a country like Egypt, unlike its neighbors, could be far more accelerated. We don't rely on oil like other countries as a commodities. Let alone, I would also like to tell you that the main opportunity is that most our neighboring countries are importing countries. And Egypt is probably unique in the sense, that we do have an agriculture, industrial, and service base that can cater to the region and can act as a gateway to Africa. So, in this respect, I think I see that there are huge opportunities that need to be leveraged by both ends.
All right, Blanca Moreno-Dodson, how do you see the perspective of the Mediterranean region facing this age shift? Because we know that for supply chain, priority has completely changed from cost optimization to risk minimization, which is the companies feels of the urgency today.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I'm delighted, and I thank ISPI and the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. I think I will start by reminding that we live in a world that's being shaped by what I call the 3 Cs: climate, conflict, and COVID. And these 3 Cs are affecting the way countries are trading with each other. First of all, we see definitely a trend towards diversification of suppliers out of necessity, and also shortening of global value chains. This is not entirely new. Even after the crisis of 2008, the percentage of total global trade going through value chains had started to decrease, but these new trends have accelerated this data. Then there is another trend that is generated by these multiple crises, which is a trend towards meeting the climate goals of decarbonization, and also triggered by necessity because there are some countries that are facing serious challenges of food security. And this also impacts the way companies are starting to look for opportunities. And then the third one is digitalization that has been accelerated by the isolation and by all these phenomena, and that could be part of the solution, right? In this context, how do we place Mediterranean countries, and why Europe would choose Mediterranean countries to relocate or reshore? Well, it's obvious: geographical and cultural proximity, reduction of the environmental impact in terms of product miles and carbon footprint, better control of inputs in terms of quality, compliance with the standards, rules of origin, etc. Of course, the strategic location between the EU and Sub-Saharan Africa for the Mediterranean, and the fact that for the first time there is an Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement that could be a game changer. A treaty that North African countries have signed, and a treaty that comes with institutional tools, unlike many other free trade agreements in the past that are still very incomplete and very partial and have not really triggered enough trade between the EU and the Mediterranean countries. And then there is a third element, which is the change in position of countries in terms of labor cost. Perhaps in the past, it was relatively cheaper to produce in China, but now Chinese salaries are higher, while Mediterranean countries, Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, they are relatively competitive in terms of salaries. So this is the time for EU enterprises to turn to Mediterranean countries to start buying their intermediate goods. So which goods are we talking about? I would like to tell you more about that, a study that we recently concluded. Is this the time, or do I do it later?
1 minute more, okay, please.
Okay, so we did a study to identify the products that Europe imports from the world and that the Mediterranean countries exports to the world. And we try to find the intersection. And we found 400 and 500, depending on the country, products that Europe imports from the rest of the world, including remotely located countries, mainly China, that the Mediterranean countries have the capacity to produce and export to Europe. So why Europe is not importing them from Mediterranean countries? And we went to a level of 6 digits, and because the time is short, I will give you the summary. This study focused on Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan, and Egypt. And we looked at the sectors and specific products for which these countries in the Mediterranean have comparative advantage, demonstrate comparative advantage. These are electrical machinery and equipment for Morocco and Tunisia, natural pearls for Egypt, salt and sulfur for Jordan, and there are many others. These are just examples. So I think the focus now needs to be on the one hand, removing the obstacles in the southern and eastern Mediterranean countries, obstacles of our absorption capacity, improving the climate, the environment for business, removing other obstacles of governance, improving the image. There are many things that have to be done, but also Europe needs to think of a strategy of co-investment, thinking of of Mediterranean countries as partners, not for isolated investment, but for mutually beneficial business. And really, Europe could have a very important catalytic effect on southern and eastern Mediterranean countries for this kind of business that is now profitable. So this is the time.
Yeah, maybe in the second round, you might be more specific on the obstacle we have to remove to get to that destination. Marco Felizati, Tariq Tafik just mentioned political will. And one of the political intention that's growing globally is friendshoring. The Secretary of Treasury in the US, Janet Yellen, just made the case for relocating American companies towards India versus China, because India is closer currently to American policy. What do you make of that, and how Italian companies are looking at that?
Quite a complex question that I'm afraid can't have a one-size-fits-all answer. In principle, I would underline a couple of things. The huge pressure for globalization hasn't ended up. There's different narratives around it, but if you take a couple of landmarks, 2008, 2016, then you will soon discover that the global trade of goods is just a little under its historical peaks. So the globalization is not ended up. What we're seeing is rather regionalization. And within this trend, we should all together, and here it is where a closer partenariat between public and private sector is in the picture, we should understand where this trend is going. Friendshoring basically means that investments and exchanging should be oriented towards countries that can ensure the stability and the reliability of global value chain. But moreover, what the Secretary Treasury Janet Yellen says is that these countries should also guarantee democratic values and economy market, full economy market status. Then, how to size them? To my knowledge, there is no shared criteria or a fixed grid to understand who are the partners. And the debate is spreading around the world and in Europe as well. My perception is that there are a lot of questions and very few answers. Just to name some, providing the allocation of resources and the productive factors with a more, let's say, political traction could possibly hinder market forces. This is an angle. Moreover, companies may be used to decide who are their clients and their suppliers according to strategies that not necessarily should be subject to the decisions of governments. Some other observers may find that such a friendshoring could possibly give states a further control on the management of the economy, and that is already ongoing with the huge amount of money that has been allocated with the recovery plans post-pandemic. So, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of questions. No doubt that this debate is central. I don't have an answer to your question. I would limit myself to very few short consideration if you allow me. What we're seeing right now is that Europe, United States, and East Asia are massively or more massively regionalizing the global value chain. We also detect such trends within the OECD countries, but you could more reasonably reconduct this to questions related to affinities in the development models rather than the ration behind friendshoring. In other words, having a list or a map, apart from the G7, apart from the great solidarity that has been established in the G7, and outreaching with Australia, New Zealand, and other countries for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, then one may ask him or herself whether the G7 is really composed by full market economies, because sometimes we witness some policies and actions and measures possibly undergoing national security reasons, or let's look at the inflation, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, that pursued objectives that could be seen as protectionism. So it is rather difficult to define who are friends, who are rivals, and for how long friends will remain friends, and if their friendship will apply to all sectors, to all circumstances, etc., etc. I don't want to take too much of your time.
Right, Marco Felizati. That's very interesting, because also political authorities and regulators are moving in this direction. In Europe, the first were the German with the Supply Chain Act that would require companies with over 3,000 employees to have a due diligence on all the supply chain in terms of respect of environment impact, but also the respect of human rights. And in Brussels is brewing a directive that next year will basically replicate the same approach. So in terms of how supply chain and the leaders inside the supply chain will have to look at their providers, it changes a lot, the view, also in terms of friends and are those who respects those kind of principle and guidelines. Marco and Apple, in this, you're driving here, you're leading here Philip Morris, which is a large multinational with a strong historic presence in Italy. So you're the one that can tell us what the impact of all of this is in a company like yours, and how you created an integrated value chain starting from local communities and local economies, but inside a global group.
Yes, so good afternoon. Thank you, Andrea, and I'm very happy of being here in MED. Philip Morris, as you know, is a former big tobacco company that 15 years ago started a journey into what we call smoke-free future, so substituting our old business with better alternatives. This has been done with a lot of investment, $9 billion in R&D, and with the creation in Italy of the largest manufacturing center that Philip Morris has worldwide, and the largest factory that was ever built in this country in this century. 60 football pitches that are producing the heated tobacco sticks with a very local value chain, as you correctly said, but a very global expansion of the markets. So how we work is we have 1,000 partners in agriculture and we are the only company that buy tobacco with a time span of 5 years, with a signature of a memorandum of understanding with the Minister of Agriculture, around $100 million invested every year, accounting for 22,500 people into agriculture. Then this tobacco arrives into our factories in Bologna, where we have machinery that are coming from this country as well. With the development of this machinery, there is also linked to the development of this country. 600 million invested last year in a 3-year plan to change our machinery into the new products. And this big ecosystem in agriculture and industry then exports into 40 countries in the world. And to give an idea, a factory that just has reached 6 years of age, it's a factory that did not exist in 2016, now exports more than olive oil, than cheese, and motorbikes that are in very important value chain. And these exports, so we have, when we're talking about near shoring, we are very close shoring, considering that this supply chain is very local. But then the expansion of this product worldwide is a fundamental tool for the country. And in this role, we have seen that, for instance, free trade agreements between, we're talking about friendshoring, but we should also talk about friend trading. Countries, for instance, that have been historically friends and historically with the consumers that are quite alike, with Italians loving Japanese products and vice versa, Japanese loving Italian products, thanks to a free trade agreement that is signed in 2017. Today, we are, together with Japan, leveraging this change in our sector, and Japan and Italy are the two countries that are more advanced into a smoke. We're not even talking about the smoke-free future for these two countries. We are talking about the smoke-free present, because the products that we are producing in Bologna are incredibly linked to Japan, and vice versa. The products of Japan, thanks to this free trade agreement, can support the Italian needs. So there is an importance of keeping a supply chain that is ready to be expanded, and Italy has everything from agriculture to industry to R&D and machinery to expand this. At the same time, we also do not have to forget how the European directives and the European community role is also crucial when we are talking about industry. I close with just a thought. I have a gigafactory in Bologna, and it cannot be fully local or sovereign industry. It's a big industrial monster, a big industrial ecosystem that is built for the world. Therefore, it's fundamental that this local value chain becomes a global value chain with agreements, with directives, with the support of modernity of new goods.
Yeah, thank you, Marco and Apple, also for mentioning Japan, so I can go back to Minister Takei Shunsuke to understand if this is reshaping the global economy. Do you see opportunities for Japan for new cooperation deals and opportunities with the EU, with the Middle East and the Mediterranean region?
Thank you very much. And between Japan and Italy, thank you for mentioning the tobacco cooperation, but also everything else, because Japanese are big fans of Italy. So I am definitely very keen on and seeing expanded cooperation with Italy and wider areas. Now, for bigger regions between Japan and Mediterranean area, the relationship of cooperation has been deepening. And here, let me just speak about human resources development and also basic infrastructure building and further cooperation with the donor countries and private sector. So first of all, companies and countries are being run by people. And in order to revitalize both, it is essential to invest in people. And this actually, human resource development is Japan's forte in assistance. And in August this year, we had a TICAD 8 meeting held in Tunisia. And this is TICAD 8 meeting, that is. And industry, health, and farming, justice and administration, so wide-ranging areas. We pledged actually to develop human resources of 300,000 people in the next 3 years. And also, as you probably maybe know, JICA, Japan's aid implementary agency, has actually implemented since 2017 in 5 years to train 22,000 people in the Middle Eastern region. So not only just public sector, but also private sector has been doing a lot in training their own employees wherever they are operating. So, of course, the human resources is important for young people. And so with Egypt, for example, in 2009, we established a university, EJUST, Egypt of Japan Science and Technology University. And through aid grants, we have been providing research and education equipment, dispatched experts, and also we have actually helped 140 African students as foreign studying students abroad. So we look forward to excellent human resources being produced by this university. So now the basic infrastructure is as important as human resources development. They are actually both sides of tires of a vehicle. And it's important that from the level of minimum living standard being maintained to the level that can support industry. This kind of growth is important, and Japan is particularly focused upon quality, because a local, of course, employment and skills is its product, as well as a resilience against disasters and protect the environment. And in the long term, it actually is the best way to save costs. Because such infrastructure will withstand problems and contribute to economic development. And also, of course, debt continuity is something that we really need to think about. So another is digitalization in telecommunication. 5G is something that all the countries are being keenly working on. And of course, 5G, it has huge impact socially. Therefore, telecommunication infrastructure building, as well as ensuring security, are both important from the viewpoint of economic security, and they need to be advanced from such a viewpoint. Open RAN and other networks need to be supported by suppliers which are diversified, safe, open, and transparent. And finally, let me talk about further cooperation with donor countries and private companies. Japan is placing a lot of importance on this collaboration being strengthened, so that rather than just pinpoint support on one country, the dots can become a facet by doing this. So Japan's own initiatives on Middle East peace issues, we have actually established a system called CPAD. It is a Council for the East Asian Promotion of Cooperation for Palestinian Development. And with Asian countries' involvement, we have supported a stable building and toward two-state solutions. And of course, we are conducting B2B meetings with between Palestine and Asian countries, so that we expect business opportunities are produced and increased, as well as Palestine's economic stability is increased. Of course, the dialogues in the Middle East is still very severe in its continuation. However, we are looking forward to continuing what we can in building trust in order to ensure a dialogue being resumed. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Minister. Blanca Moreno-Dodson, you mentioned before there are still obstacles, there are some challenges connected with this redesign of supply chain. How can the Mediterranean countries and as a region profit from this new thinking at the future of supply chain and trying to remove some of these obstacles? What do you have in mind?
Yes. When we look at the Mediterranean, there is tremendous diversity, and the quality of the governance is very diverse. There are some countries that have governments that can implement programs with certain consistency. There are others that have so many governance issues that it's hard to predict what's going to happen. And this affects the confidence for investors. So we cannot look at the Mediterranean as a whole. We have to look country by country. All these crises also have created tremendous rigidities in terms of fiscal space because, for example, Morocco that has had a 40% debt to GDP ratio before the crisis. Now it's about 80%, and the average for the region is above 80%. In some countries, 100%, Lebanon more than 100%. This means fiscal risk, risk premia, and discouragement of investors. So these are some of the macro variables, but also at the micro level, the difficulties to create an enterprise, to create a partnership between the public and the private sector. They're very different country by country. A lot of them have more red tape, more difficulties. There are issues of connectivity, physical connectivity in terms of connection among countries and how much it costs to take a product through customs. But there are also issues of digital connectivity because some of the laws are still obsolete. They need to be updated because some of them were created when the digital economy didn't exist. So again, Morocco is a leader in that. Lebanon has also recently approved an e-commerce law, but this is another thing that needs to be revised to provide more opportunities. And there are other obstacles that really should be removed for countries to have the capacity to absorb know-how and technologies coming from countries that are more advanced. But I think I want to emphasize one point, which is that these countries cannot do it alone. And if for the EU and the northern Mediterranean countries, it's difficult to look at them as a bloc because there is no political dialogue between them or because the differences are too big in terms of governance and levels of confidence, I think more efforts need to be done, at least bilaterally, to think of models that are win-win. This is not, again, I insist in the word partnership, co-investments, based on interdependency, because the Mediterranean has a lot of the solutions. Look at the energy. The south of the Mediterranean could produce renewable energy enough for themselves and for Europe to have energy security. And yet, the percentage allocated to renewable energies in the Mediterranean is extremely small and is not increasing. It's increasing, but very, very timidly. So there is so much room for co-investments that seek this mutual benefit, and therefore has to come from both sides of the Mediterranean,
Correct,
I believe, in an integrated way.
Connectivity is at the base of supply chain, and talking connectivity, what's the relevance of infrastructure projects, free trade zone also in Egypt? How do you see the future, and how to remove some of the obstacles that were just mentioned?
Well, it's a tricky question, you know. I mean, but anyway, let me just elaborate on integration. You know, like you rightfully said, you know, every country is standalone, even though we have free trade agreements, you know, we have rules of origin, we have customs connectivity. I mean, everything is done on paper. Yet, you know, there are protectionist measures, you know, on individual countries that are self-serving. Let alone, I believe that a model like the EU in itself, by having a EU community, removing all barriers, and to have a demand-driven approach by which you would be able to entice So you can start by bilateral agreements, or bilateral cooperation, but, with having more a value chain or a supply chain integration within the region based on a demand-driven side from the EU, I think you can have a transformation in the region and have it act collectively. So that's number one. The second thing, when we talk about, you mentioned, the debt level. Debt level dictates on countries, notably like Egypt, that there is going to be an expanded role by the private sector. So PPP is the name of the game. It is the solution. The government debt is close to 90% of GDP. Private sector debt is almost nothing. So it's time to reallocate part of the national debt to the private sector to assume its responsibility. And in this respect, it requires divestiture of state-owned enterprises, state-owned infrastructure, in collaboration with IFIs and the private sector to assume their role and to alleviate a good part of the debt. And this way, it gives space for the government to breathe and in order to assume its own responsibility. And this is happening in Egypt right now. What does this require? It requires clarity. Number one, in fiscal policies and transparency. It requires transparency in a clear monetary policies, and it also requires a very clear path, for the government to divest. So, in Egypt right now, there is a statement, there is a document that will be issued in the coming few weeks, clearly identifying which sectors, which companies the government is going to exit, and by which way, and who is to be the target investors. So, this is really one of the main issues that will be opening and inviting, investments into the economy in multiple sectors. The second thing, is also, again, having a clear clarity or a plan on cutting the red tape, which is something that we are working as the civil society very closely with the government by dissecting on sectoral basis the impediments and working closely to alleviate most of these obstacles. And one of the fastest track is digital transportation and digitizing governmental services at large, notably customs, taxes, which constitute probably the highest barrier of entry to the country. So, along with all these measures, I think Egypt is in the coming period. And by the way, it's a direct consequence of the COVID and the Ukraine crisis. Hadn't that happened, I think we would have gone in a different course. So it is imposing on us a new reality, and I think it should be the same with the rest of the Mediterranean countries.
Sure, Felizati. Now, it's a big challenge also for policymaker, because we just heard that public-private partnership could be the key. At the same time, there's at the political level a wish to protect internal and domestic economies. So what do you make of that, and what do you expect also from policymaker at European country level?
Public-private sector is definitely the key. I can't see any other way for bridging over regulators and economic operators. And in this framework, business organizations has a lot to do, and they're doing a lot. I was very attentive during the last two interventions, because the number of bottlenecks and barriers and obstacles you may find around the world is literally very, very wide. And business can help governments, paving the way, finding right solutions, providing technological process and tools and means to face an increasing number of challenges, from conformity, security, assessment, custom controls that continues to overlap one to another, to the lack of digital standards around the world. So there's a very wide variety of issues here. I very much agree also that there is virtually no way to see the MENA region as a whole and individual approaches. But there are things that governments can do at a higher level for everyone. And here you would need a better multilateralism, which we don't have. Have a look at the WTO, for example. If you have irritants or problems or obstacles to tackle, you don't even have a dispute settlement body fully functioning. And I don't see the solution around the corner. So there is a huge responsibility for the public regulations and governments. Resilience, and I will finish here, is a nice word. Everybody talks about resilience, but most of them often forgets that the very bulk of its burden is on the business shoulder. If you don't have flexibilities in companies and their ability to adapt to sudden disruptions, then the world exchanges would have cracked down irremediably since long. So before setting the bar too high, I would warmly suggest the government level to be more in a listening mood towards the business sectors. For example, the G20 and the G7s are very fruitful formats where business has a role to play, and we do. In Paris, with the OECD, we also do. In Europe, with Business Europe, with the European Union, at bilateral level. So there is virtually no channels that we don't keep ourselves busy with. But companies can do a lot, but cannot solve all problems on their own.
All right, Marco and Apple, we just mentioned flexibility, resilience. What have you learned from the way that your company, your plants here reacted to disruption like the pandemic and then the war? You've got a long and complex supply chain. What does it mean for you looking at the future of globalization and international trade?
We have been lucky to honestly think beforehand to this situation, and we anticipated some of the large issues that we're facing today. Italy, for instance, this summer has been under a water lack crisis, and for us it's very important. Tobacco plants are extremely tall and in need of water, and for instance, we have worked together with our partners because this optimization, you cannot do it alone. When you are having a captaincy over a value chain, you need to do it together, and we did it, for instance, in agriculture. Reducing 40% already 3 years ago we started this process, and this year we have 40% less usage of water in the fields in Italy. To give an idea, we're saving an amount of water like Lake Maggiore in Italy. In the factory at the same time we have optimized our way of working water, and we are saving 200,000 cubic meters in the factory versus when it was built. Energy. We have one of the largest solar panel plants, industrial plants in Europe, and we started to build even more onto renewable energy. At the same time, in agriculture, we are leveraging biofuel. Practically all our fields do not use any more fossil fuel. And also we are using biogas for the usage of the heating systems of tobacco. So to be ready on these matters, we started some years ago. Still a lot of issues in these long supply chains that we have, with some disruption last year. One, it was of course on semiconductors for our electronic devices, solved. The other was on many of the items that we usually got from Asia that now we are also in some way still continuing to get from Asia, but at the same time having a double value chain coming from
At the
Europe.
end of the day, will you export more or less in 2023 from Italy to the rest of the world?
We are for sure less exposed today than we were last year, considering that we have having a funnel of our providers of goods. The system on which we are operating is pretty straightforward, so we don't need a lot of external suppliers. We are leveraging also the local suppliers. Consider that we are having 7,500 companies in our supply chain in Italy, plus of course 1,000 growers. So local agreements are for sure contributing to and offsetting of the risk of the longer supply
All right,
chain.
I think that we ended up with a good best practice of resilience and sustainability also inside the supply chain. So ladies and gentlemen, thanks all to our panelists. Thank you, Minister. Thank you all for the discussion, and enjoy the rest of the Med.